Have you ever felt like the extra in someone else's story? Like you were there to support, to serve, to suffer, while someone else got the spotlight, the applause, the title of main character? Maybe they never called you by name. Maybe you were the friend who listened, the daughter who stayed quiet, the student who disappeared between the lines. If so, this story was written for you. They called me necessary. Not beloved, not even noticed, just necessary. I was the emotional glue they spread across someone else's arc. I was the hand that reached out a second too late, the voice that screamed a warning when no one was listening. They gave me enough lines to be remembered for a scene, but not enough to be missed. In every version of the tale, I died beautifully and conveniently, just in time for someone else's awakening. And by the time the real story began, my body was already cooling in the margins. I didn't realize it at first, that I was written to be forgotten. Not until the 5th episode. That was the day they finally gave me a name, Cassiel. Soft on the tongue, easy to bury. Before that, I was the roommate. The girl beside her bed. The one who brought the prophecy. Gifted tea when her visions made her collapse. I thought I was being kind. Loyal. Useful. I called her Myra like everyone else did. Golden-haired, prophecy-kissed, fate-bound Myra. She was the thread-bearer, the chosen light, the girl the narrative circled around like a sun. I lived in her orbit like dust, and I smiled as I did it. Because I hadn't yet learned that even stars burn out in silence. Elisa Academy was a beautiful prison. Polished wood staircases curved like a script being written midair. The windows bore stained glass prophecies etched in 7 languages, each one glinting like a future already decided. They taught us early that the world ran on rules, narrative binding, the law of causality, the hero's journey. We didn't ask why stories worked. We were only taught to obey the arc, to trust the ink, to know our place. But I, stupid, desperate I, wanted to matter. So I learned the structure, memorized the tropes, highlighted the 5-act descent into redemption, and marked where side characters were allowed to cry. I studied tragedy like it was scripture. And still, no one looked at me. Myra glowed without needing to try. Her hair was the kind that moved even when the wind didn't. Her laughter made soldiers lower their swords, and when she touched a book, the text reshaped to suit her level of comprehension. She was the kind of girl stories adored. Not for who she was, but for what she could symbolize. Hope, change, sacrifice. I watched her from the corner of our shared chamber, where my bed was always just slightly colder than hers. I warmed tea with magic I wasn't technically allowed to use and burned my fingers on wax to seal her letters. I told myself I was being kind, but somewhere, quietly, I hoped she'd remember. That she'd look up one day and say my name with the same reverence people said hers. She didn't. The thing about being close to the spotlight is that it never quite reaches you. It outlines your silhouette in contrast, but you're never actually lit. I saw things from that edge that no one else did. I noticed how Renvale, Myra's designated love interest, paused too long before touching her hand. How he lingered in doorways like he was waiting to be rewritten. I watched how Mara, the supposed antagonist, didn't speak because her lines weren't scripted yet. Not because she was evil. She had flame marble eyes and a silence that screamed rebellion. But the story called her villain before she had ever spoken a word. I began to wonder, who decides what matters? One night, after Myra had collapsed from a vision and been carried off to the Temple of Clarity for her soul to be realigned, I walked the halls alone. My fingers trembled with a grief that wasn't mine but clung to me like a second skin. Myra would recover. She always did. Her arc had protection. I, on the other hand, would still be the one who failed to catch her in time. Still the one whose hand reached out after the fall. I remember stopping beneath the portrait of Alira the Unwritten, our academy's only unarchived student. Her plaque read, "Lost to narrative error." The stone beneath my feet felt hollow that night, like something was buried beneath it. For a moment I imagined digging through the floor with my bare hands just to find something the story hadn't already claimed, something unfinished. I didn't find anything that night, but the desire to claw out of the story, that began there. In class, Professor Reith spoke about the nature of plot devices. He called them necessary stabilizers. They existed to provoke growth, to deliver loss, to pull the hero back from despair, or push them into it. Not every character gets an arc, he said, looking right past me. Some are destined only to be remembered. But I didn't remember, not truly, because even memory requires significance. What I had was presence, a presence so functional it became invisible. I started dreaming in script notes, stage directions. Enter Cassiel. She speaks comfortably. Exim, enter Cassiel. The audience cries. Sometimes I dreamed of being cut altogether, of pages where my lines were crossed out, rewritten in someone else's font, of ink that didn't know my shape anymore. I would wake in sweat and silence, heart pounding like I had just survived a scene that no one saw. Still, I tried. I stitched Myra's name into her scarf when the winds turned. I rewrote her presentation when she fell asleep. I took the blame when she misread a prophecy and the chancellor nearly expelled her. And when she cried, her tears glittering like the stars they said she embodied, I knelt beside her like a well-trained shadow. She held my hand once, just once, and whispered, "You're so good to me, Mira," and she got my name wrong. That was the moment I stopped trying to belong in her story. There's a silence that becomes a kind of scream, the kind that builds in your ribs, growing louder the longer you bite it back. That was what I carried as I walked the academy halls, my steps echoing through the polished corridors of fate. I memorized the laws, the binds, the boundaries, not to follow them, but because I knew that someday I'd find the crack in their foundation. And when I did, I wouldn't ask for a place in their story. I'd tear it apart and write something that finally remembered me. So yes, I was written to be forgotten. But I never forgot them. The truth didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in like dust beneath a locked door. Silent, persistent, and easy to ignore if you didn't want to see it. But I had spent too long watching the cracks, listening for inconsistencies in what was supposed to be fate. When you're always on the edge of the scene, you learn to pay attention to the parts they never highlight. I started to notice how Renvale's eyes didn't match his arc. He was supposed to be love incarnate, Myra's emotional tether. But he hesitated, not once, but often. His fingers would hover near hers, his gaze flickering just slightly away in pivotal moments. And when he kissed her, I saw the difference. His lips moved with choreography, not devotion. There was no heat in it, only obligation, like he knew his lines, but not the feeling behind them. That was the first crack. The second came during an illumination ceremony when Myra's eyes flashed gold in the same way Mara's had in the archives. The exact same way. The narrative had spent 3 books demonizing Mara's transformation. Flame-burned, twisted, tragic, and now it was painting Myra's with sacred light? I felt something twist in my stomach then. Not jealousy, not quite. It was recognition. The realization that the same symbols were being repainted in different colors depending on who wore them. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee anything. I began collecting these fragments, like forbidden verses, quiet moments when the script faltered, where the characters moved like they were waiting for cues that came late. I stayed up at night, rereading old editions of Elisar's Chronicles, tracing marginalia written in angry script, scribbled revisions in older languages. The deeper I looked, the more I saw the invisible hands that had arranged everything. Myra's glowing prophecy wasn't divine, it was designed. I started circling patterns, underlining familiar phrases, stringing red thread across the timelines of people whose lives had been chopped and reassembled to suit narrative rhythm. Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a lie. The truth kept whispering to me through ink-stained parchment and skipped lines of dialogue, but it was the silence that confirmed it. When I asked Professor Talon why the same glyphs marked both Mara's destruction and Myra's salvation, he paused, then asked me why I cared. "Some knowledge is reserved for protagonists," he said, like it was supposed to soothe me, but it curdled something inside. Because I wasn't asking to be the hero, I was asking to understand why the rules only bent for some. I needed proof, and that's when I began breaking curfew. The library in Elisar was not one place. It was a world unto itself. Layers of archives stacked like sediment, each generation burying the one before it. Most students never went below level 4. By level 7, the air felt different, heavier, like breathing through velvet. And beyond level 9, you needed permission, sealed in bone. I went down with nothing but candlelight and quiet fury. It took me 3 nights to find the altar. It was built beneath a forgotten stairwell, a half-collapsed arch leading to a dais no longer recognized by the Academy's main floor plan. I wouldn't have found it at all if not for the ghost of a page. An outline of a chapter that didn't exist in the current binding. Chapter 0, it whispered in phantom script, and beneath it a square of stone that didn't echo when I tapped it. I scraped the corner until my fingers bled, until a thin seam cracked open and something shifted beneath it. That's when I saw the pen. It was nothing grand, not gilded or glowing, just red, a lacquered shell that pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. I didn't question how I knew what it was. I had read enough forbidden texts, heard enough cautionary tales and hushed faculty voices to know. This was a narrative weapon. The kind of artifact that could undo destiny with a single line. It was outlawed, sacrilegious, and the moment I touched it, it knew me. My vision narrowed. The candle beside me dimmed until the shadows pressed inward like ink bleeding from a cracked seal. My name spilled onto the ground without my hand moving. Cassiel, Eleanor, Vane. Written not in my script, but in one I'd only seen etched into the older stained glass windows. Legacy script. Arc-forged ink. The kind of name that couldn't be erased. And I felt it. Something locked into place inside me. It wasn't power, not the flashy kind. It was clear. Like I had been walking on uneven stone my whole life, and suddenly the ground aligned. I inhaled, and for once the air didn't resist me. I existed. Not as a function, not as a stepping stone, but as a source. I clutched the pen, pressed it to my skin, and whispered, "Mine." The red ink didn't burn, it hummed. I left the altar chamber with trembling hands and fire behind my ribs. The hallways above felt different, as if the Academy sensed what I had taken. The portraits on the wall tilted subtly, as though trying not to look at me directly. One of the chandeliers dimmed without explanation. For the first time, the narrative noticed me. That night, I stood before my mirror and said my full name aloud. Not like a whisper, but like a dare. Cassiel Eleanor Vane. The glass trembled. A hairline fracture split across its center, and when I stepped back, I wasn't afraid of it breaking. I wanted it to. Later, as I stood at the top of the dormitory stairs, I saw Myra bathed in light, surrounded by adoring faces, Ren at her side, professors murmuring prophecy, and I knew then that I had stepped beyond the frame. I no longer belonged to the scene. I had become something they hadn't planned for. They cast the light forward, but I had learned the story by tracing the shadows. They named the chosen, but now I would name myself. And for the first time, the story began with me. The truth didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in like dust beneath a locked door, silent, persistent, and easy to ignore if you didn't want to see it. But I had spent too long watching the cracks, listening for inconsistencies in what was supposed to be fate. When you're always on the edge of the scene, you learn to pay attention to the parts they never highlight. I started to notice how Renvale's eyes didn't match his arc. He was supposed to be love incarnate, Myra's emotional tether. But he hesitated, not once, but often. His fingers would hover near hers, his gaze flickering just slightly away in pivotal moments. And when he kissed her, I saw the difference. His lips moved with choreography, not devotion. There was no heat in it. Only obligation, like he knew his lines but not the feeling behind them. That was the first crack. The second came during an illumination ceremony, when Myra's eyes flashed gold in the same way Myra's had in the archives, the exact same way. The narrative had spent 3 books demonizing Myra's transformation, flame-burned, twisted, tragic, and now it was painting Myra's with sacred light? I felt something twist in my stomach then. Not jealousy, not quite. It was recognition. The realization that the same symbols were being repainted in different colors depending on who wore them, and once I saw that, I couldn't unsee anything. I began collecting these fragments like forbidden verses. Quiet moments when the script faltered, where the characters moved like they were waiting for cues that came late. I stayed up at night rereading old editions of Elisar's Chronicles, tracing marginalia written in angry script, scribbled revisions in older languages. The deeper I looked, the more I saw the invisible hands that had arranged everything. Myra's glowing prophecy wasn't divine. It was designed. I started circling patterns, underlining familiar phrases, stringing red thread across the timelines of people whose lives had been chopped and reassembled to suit narrative rhythm. Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a lie. The truth kept whispering to me through ink-stained parchment and skipped lines of dialogue, but it was the silence that confirmed it. When I asked Professor Tallon why the same glyphs marked both Mara's destruction and Myra's salvation, he paused, then asked me why I cared. "Some knowledge is reserved for protagonists," he said, like it was supposed to soothe me, but it curdled something inside. Because I wasn't asking to be the hero, I was asking to understand why the rules only bent for some. I needed proof, and that's when I began breaking curfew. The library in Elisar was not one place, it was a world unto itself. Layers of archives stacked like sediment, each generation burying the one before it. Most students never went below level 4. By level 7, the air felt different, heavier, like breathing through velvet. And beyond level 9, you needed permission sealed in bone. I went down with nothing but candlelight and quiet fury. It took me 3 nights to find the altar. It was built beneath a forgotten stairwell, a half-collapsed arch leading to a dais no longer recognized by the Academy's main floor plan. I wouldn't have found it at all if not for the ghost of a page, an outline of a chapter that didn't exist in the current binding. Chapter 0, it whispered in phantom script, and beneath it a square of stone that didn't echo when I tapped it. I scraped the corner until my fingers bled, until a thin seam cracked open and something shifted beneath it, as when I saw the pen. It was nothing grand, not gilded or glowing, just bread, a lacquered shell that pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. I didn't question how I knew what it was. I had read enough forbidden texts, heard enough cautionary tales in hushed faculty voices to know. This was a narrative weapon, the kind of artifact that could undo destiny with a single line. It was outlawed, sacrilegious, and the moment I touched it, it knew me. My vision narrowed. The candle beside me dimmed until the shadows pressed inward like ink bleeding from a cracked seal. My name spilled onto the ground without my hand moving. Cassiel, Eleanor, Vane. Written not in my script, but in one I'd only seen etched into the older, stained-glass windows. Legacy script. Arc-forged ink. The kind of name that couldn't be erased. And I felt it. Something locked into place inside me. It wasn't power, not the flashy kind. It was clear, like I had been walking on uneven stone my whole life, and suddenly the ground aligned. I inhaled, and for once, the air didn't resist me. I existed. Not as a function, not as a stepping stone, but as a source. I clutched the pen, pressed it to my skin, and whispered, "Mine." The red ink didn't burn. It hummed. I left the altar chamber with trembling hands and fire behind my ribs. The hallways above felt different, as if the Academy sensed what I had taken. The portraits on the wall tilted subtly, as though trying not to look at me directly. One of the chandeliers dimmed without explanation. For the first time, the narrative noticed me. That night, I stood before my mirror and said my full name aloud, not like a whisper, but like a dare. Cassiel Eleanor Vane. The glass trembled. A hairline fracture split across its center, and when I stepped back, I wasn't afraid of it breaking. I wanted it to. Later, as I stood at the top of the dormitory stairs, I saw Myra, bathed in light, surrounded by adoring faces, Ren at her side, professors murmuring prophecy, and I knew then that I had stepped beyond the frame. I no longer belonged to the scene. I had become something they hadn't planned for. They cast the light forward, but I had learned the story by tracing the shadows. They named the chosen, but now I would name myself. And for the first time, the story began with me. They called it the Archive of Reverent Plotlines, a chamber sealed with runes of continuity and glasslock memory spells. Only legacy scribes were permitted beyond its second threshold, and only under narrative supervision. I entered it alone, under dusk's silence, guided by the red pen's hume and a rising ache in my ribs that whispered, "They've already decided how you die." The forbidden stairwell beneath the east wing was lined with warnings etched in past blood, but the story had already rewritten my fear into fuel. I didn't tremble. I descended. The manuscript I found was slim, bound in spine-strained leather, its pages soft with pre-read grief. My fingers paused over the title, Cassiel Eleanor Vane, Variant D. I opened it like one might open a casket, and there she was. Me. Crying in the rain, Renvale's cloak around my shoulders. Myra standing broken beneath a shattered dome of prophecy. In the final panels, Myra forgives me with her last breath, telling me I was never the villain. And then I, silent, shamed, weeping, vanish into the snow while Ren watches, alone. It was beautifully tragic, elegantly composed. A necessary betrayal arc. I was meant to kiss Ren by mistake, to be caught in a moment scripted to provoke heartbreak. Then I would sob an apology, fight beside Myra one last time, and crumble in the aftermath. Her death absolving me, the audience moved to tears. A perfect little rupture. Memorable, clean, disposable. I couldn't breathe. My mouth opened, but no air came. My heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to escape the scene. I reread the page with shaking fingers, tracing the ink that was never mine but had been poured like poison into my shape. There were annotations in the margins, cold and technical. Maximize emotional whiplash. Tears on P17 enhance catharsis. Maintain audience sympathy through remorse. I was less character than craft. I dropped the manuscript. The pen trembled in my pocket like it sensed my rage. But I didn't grab it out of vengeance. Not yet. I stood there for what felt like an entire act, watching my own future carved by a hand that never asked me what I wanted. My arc wasn't a tragedy. It was a tool. And worse, it was false. Because I wasn't in love with Renvale. I never had been. There was a moment, weeks before I found the altar, buried like a soft breath between chapters. I was deep in the archive stacks, alone and pretending to study the glyph shift laws when a hand reached for the same spine I did. Mara, the antagonist, flame-eyed, arc-damned, written to fall and burn and roar. Her fingertips brushed mine across the leather binding, and she didn't flinch. Most people did. My presence made them uncomfortable. Too silent, too hard to place. But Mara only looked at me, unblinking. Her eyes weren't on fire. They were forged steel in moonlight. Clear, steady, and tired of being misunderstood. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I remember how the air felt heavier when she stood beside me, how the silence was different with her, not empty, but thick with meaning. There was no script between us, no cue to follow, just two forgotten girls in the dark, reaching for the same truth. That was the first time I wanted more than survival. Oh, no, I wasn't in love with Ren. But they wrote me to be. They wrote me to fall neatly into a triangle, to shatter beautifully for the benefit of the chosen. They wrote me to be conflicted and then vanished. And suddenly I understood why the red pen had found me. I was never meant to be saved. I was meant to be used. I betrayed the script. Not loudly, not violently, quietly like a breath drawn before a scream. I returned to the dorms that night and stood over Myra's bed as she dreamed. Her brows furrowed. She always looked troubled in sleep, like even her visions couldn't leave her alone. She was beautiful, but not real, not to me. Not anymore. I opened the red pen and wrote a single alteration in the footnotes of her next chapter. In this iteration, Myra does not awaken with a prophecy, she simply sleeps. The ink bled softly into the ether, and her breathing slowed. I gave her silence. A moment without fate pulling at her ribs, just rest, for once. Then I walked to the west-facing wall and wrote something else. A line for Mara, a single line. The moment the ink met air, the walls flickered. I heard a low creak, as if the world was adjusting itself around the change. Somewhere, a candle snuffed. The sky outside burned dull red for a heartbeat, then blinked back to black. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet. But it was interference. A crack. A breath. A refusal. And the story was noticed. The next morning, Myra slept in. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't jolt awake with divine tremors. She mumbled about warmth, rolled over, and smiled. I watched her quietly. Maybe she'd never know. Maybe I didn't want her to. Not everything we do needs to be witnessed to matter. But something had shifted. The manuscript still burned behind my eyes. The kiss I was meant to give Ren still sour in my mouth. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't believe it. I had seen my death choreographed for a tearful climax, and the love they gave me was a lie. And yet, I had already burned for someone else. The fire was never Ren's. It was Mara's. So I held the pen with both hands and whispered into the quiet. You wrote me to fall for him, but I already burned for someone else. And I knew what I had to do next. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves like breath over parchment. Quiet, deliberate, dangerous only because it's unseen. That's what I became in the weeks that followed, a breath in the script, an invisible red thread weaving through scenes I was never meant to touch. I didn't strike loudly, I didn't tear pages or announce myself to fate. I adjusted, nudged, whispered through ink. I didn't rewrite destiny, I questioned it. And that, I learned, was enough to make it unravel. It began small. A confession scene, meant to happen under a midnight tree, delayed by a sudden rain. A relic, destined to be found in the South Tower, inexplicably shifted to the East Garden. Ren's sword cracked mid-duel, just enough to fracture his heroic rhythm. A line that once read, "You are my light, Myra," now ended with hesitation. You are light. No one noticed the edits but me. No one suspected the quiet girl in the back row, head bowed in obedience. I wore their invisibility like a spell. And all the while, I kept writing lines for Mara. Not full monologues, just fragments, phrase, enough to stretch her silence into something sentient. One morning, she passed the oracle's chamber and paused, exactly where I'd written she might. She looked at the wall, then turned, as if hearing something that wasn't there before. I held my breath behind the stacks. She never looked at me, but I felt it, her awareness sharpening, her scene tilting. That was the moment I knew. My pen wasn't just altering outcomes, it was waking characters up. But with every adjustment came resistance. The story fought back in strange, slanted ways. Dialogue stuttered in class, lines repeating or misaligning with the speaker's lips. A window that always faced east suddenly poured sunset light. Timelines warped. A classmate mentioned an event that hadn't happened yet. The narrative was glitching. A beast made of structure and design, suddenly aware that its bones were shifting without permission. I should have stopped. I didn't. Because for once, I was choosing something. I wasn't just reacting, surviving, functioning. I was curating space. For myself, yes, but also for those the story had caged. Especially Myra. I had spent so long resenting her glow, her prophecy, the weight of attention around her, but now I saw her for what she really was. Not chosen, but trapped. She didn't move unless cued. She didn't speak unless summoned. She was a marionette of gold thread and exhausted grace. So I gave her something I'd never been given, stillness. I rewrote her next encounter with the Seer of 12 Paths. Originally, it was a turning point scene, an awakening, a surge of pain that split her open so she could grow. I changed it. Just a few lines. I removed the surge. I replaced the awakening with a pause. In my version, the Seer's words faltered. Myra blinked. And for the first time, she asked nothing. She was allowed to simply be. That night, she slept deeper than I'd ever seen. No visions, no whimpers, just quiet. Her chest rising slow beneath the moonlight, her fingers unclenched from prophecy for once. I watched her from the doorway, pen still warm in my palm, and felt something settle inside me. I didn't rewrite her ending, I gave her a way out. But fate, like all systems built to control, hates mercy. The sky bled red the next morning, not soft, not symbolic, violent, as if the sun had torn its own veil. The tower bells rang out of rhythm. The trees outside the academy trembled despite no wind. A group of students reported a blackout in their prophecy mirrors. One girl claimed she looked at her reflection and saw someone else's fate staring back. And still, no one suspected me. Except Mara. It began with a glance. She walked past me in the hall, and for the briefest moment her gaze caught. Locked. Her eyes flickered, not surprise, not hostility, recognition. Like she'd seen my signature written into the margins of her scene. She didn't speak. But the next day, I found it. A folded slip of parchment behind the West Wing tapestry. My name wasn't on it. There was no greeting, no signature. Just a sentence scrawled in sharp, defiant script. If they won't write you in, carve your way out. I held that note in my hand for a long time. Longer than I'd held any truth before. The parchment pulsed faintly against my skin. Her words didn't feel like prophecy. They felt like permission. I reread it under candlelight, heart clattering inside me. It wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. She had noticed, she had remembered, and somehow, through the haze of rewritten memory and villain-coded scenes, Mara saw the shape of my rebellion. And it made me bold. I pulled out the red pen again. This time, I didn't write in a margin. I wrote on the back of a sacred text, directly over the scene outlined for the upcoming trial. Myra was meant to take the stand, tearfully accuse Mara of betrayal, and awaken a new crest of light. I changed it, just one sentence. Myra forgets her fear. I didn't know what would happen. Maybe nothing. Maybe the story would devour me whole. But that didn't matter anymore. I had found the fracture, and I wasn't going back, because I had tasted what it meant to matter, and I would not return to silence for their comfort. Fate isn't a god. It's just an editor with deadlines. And I had missed mine on purpose. It wasn't thunder that summoned me, it was silence. A peculiar, too clean kind that swept through the corridors like a swallowed breath. The kind of silence stories use when they're preparing to shift something. I had known it was coming. From the moment the ink vial shattered in my coat pocket and left behind a message scorched into the fabric. You've been seen. I'd felt the story's gaze tighten. I had pushed too far, too fast, and now it will push back. The summons came on parchment, softer than flesh, sealed in silver wax with a sigil no student was ever meant to see. The moment I touched it, the air around me stilled. Even the torches bowed inward. I walked alone, past arches that curved like question marks, past portraits of protagonists that flickered when I passed. As I descended the spiral leading to the scriptorium, the deepest chamber beneath Elisar, I heard my own footsteps echo in strange delay, like the floor was deciding whether I still belonged. He was waiting in the center of the stained glass hall, Lucian Reith, the scribe behind the narrative. The man who, they whispered, once convinced a child hero to accept death before their arc even began. His robes shimmered with languages that no longer had speakers. His hands were thin, graceful, dangerous, each finger ink-stained and steady. And his eyes? They didn't see you. They saw what you could be scripted into. He didn't look surprised when I entered. Caesal, he said, like he was correcting a typo. It took longer than I expected, but you've reached the inevitable crossroad. I stayed silent, not out of fear, but strategy. When you're unsure of what's scripted, silence can't be misquoted. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing as if trying to ink me into understanding. You're clever, subtle. You don't crave the spotlight, only shape the shadows behind it. That's rare. And dangerous. You understand structure. You understand pain. That makes you viable. I almost laughed. Viable. As if I were being offered a scholarship instead of a sentence. He gestured, and the stained glass wall behind him shifted. Myra, Ren, Mara, all frozen mid-scene, locked in curated pain and pre-approved triumph. They were beautiful and tragic and so painfully designed, but behind them, faint, unfinished, was a blurred figure. Me. A ghost at the edge of every panel. You've done more damage than most rogue pens manage in a decade, Lucien said. But I don't want to erase you. That's too expected. I'm offering you something better. He extended a hand, and suddenly the chamber shimmered with possibilities. Visions of side plots blooming midair. Cassiel, beloved of a doomed prince. Cassiel, who sacrifices herself to halt an avalanche and becomes a folk ballad. Cassiel, the girl who was loved wrongly, died nobly, and was mourned just enough to be remembered. Each vision glowed like a tragedy wrapped in ribbon. You'll keep your name, he said. You'll even keep a chapter, maybe two. But you must return the pen, undo the fractures, let the narrative realign. I stared at the scenes. So vivid, so tempting. For a second, I saw myself at the center. People are crying for me. Statues built in my name. A soft, mournful melody composed for the girl who gave up everything. A perfect side plot. But even as I stood in the glow of it, I felt something colder beneath my skin. Something rigid, sharp, alive. My story, still unwritten. My hands trembled, but not with indecision, with fury. Because none of those visions were me. They were versions of me that would make the audience weep without letting me speak. You're not meant to write, Lucien said, voice silk over steel. You're meant to break hearts and fade. My voice was steady when it came. Then why did you give me a voice that echoes? He blinked. Not confusion, calculation. A flicker of wariness. He saw it too late, that I hadn't come here to listen. I came here to write. I pulled the pen from my sleeve. Red, silent, burning. Lucien stepped back. Cassiel, be careful, this place. I didn't let him finish. I stepped to the center of the stained glass floor, where all threads converged, and bent down on one knee. My breath shook, my hands pulsed with ink, and I wrote a single sentence into the light beneath my feet. The chamber screamed. Light poured from the stained glass like it had been holding its breath for centuries. The windows cracked. Myra's image shattered. Ren's sword melted mid-swing. Mara burned brighter than the sun, and behind them, the ghost girl blurred into clarity. A new panel formed above the broken wall. A girl with wild, ink-stained fingers, hair curling with static, eyes wide open. A girl not weeping, not fading, but writing. I collapsed. The floor caught me like paper, thin, sharp, unfamiliar. My limbs trembled, my pulse thinned, and the pen rolled from my fingers. But it didn't fall. It floated, hung midair, waiting, watching. Lucien said nothing, because he no longer held the narrative. I did, and for the first time, the story knew my name. And I was afraid. There are cruelties more precise than death. I used to think fire was the worst thing they could do to a girl like Mara, but I was wrong. Fire leaves ash, memory, a place to mourn. What they did instead was colder, crueler. They didn't kill her. They made her forget. I woke up on stone, alone. The scriptorium was cracked in half, its stained glass windows reduced to colorless shards. My blood pooled beside my name etched into the floor. The red pen was still floating, watching, waiting. The narrative hadn't destroyed me. It had rewritten me. At first, I thought the changes were subtle. The faculty avoided my eyes more than usual. Myra passed me in the corridor without even a flicker of recognition. I reached for the Academy logbook to see if my absence had been recorded. My name was gone. Not crossed out, not redacted. Just never there. I flipped through parchment, hands trembling, breath shortening. Cassiel Eleanor Vane no longer existed in the registrar, in class notes, in prophecy assignments. Even the gossip panels had erased me. I wasn't a shadow anymore. I was a ghost trapped between narrative walls that had sealed me out. I ran to the dormitory mirror. It reflected the room, the bed, the fading candle, but not me. I reached for my face, I felt my breath, I whispered my name like a prayer into glass that would not hold me. Nothing. Nothing. The narrative had found its answer to rebellion, not by silencing me, but by convincing the world I had never spoken. But that wasn't the worst of it. Mara didn't remember me. She walked past me in the courtyard, her stride sharp as ever, her eyes flint and flame. But they didn't pause, didn't soften, didn't widen in that brief flicker of mutual knowing I had once clutched like salvation. I followed her, desperate. Unraveling. She was speaking now, confidence, scripted, saying lines she never had before. She told a professor that she had no patience for traitors, said she'd never trusted shadows. It was me. She meant me. They had written me into her backstory as a betrayal she'd always hated. And I couldn't breathe. I leaned against the corridor wall, heart caving in like a collapsed panel, the ink inside me trying to claw its way out. The pen trembled in my sleeve but didn't glow. It knew. Even it couldn't touch a memory that had been rewritten at the root. I remembered the archive. Her hand is on the same spine. The quiet that held us. The way she hadn't flinched. How her eyes had seen me. Not as useful, not as tragic, but as whole. That was real. That was mine. And now it is gone. But I remembered, and that meant it still lived, because memory once carried cannot be stolen. It can only be ignored. I wandered through LSR like a fading afterthought. The professors taught around me, the students saw through me. Myra laughed with Ren again. Perfect. Bright. Shallow. Their tragedy had been rewritten too, polished into a bittersweet love arc that held no space for what I had disrupted. Even my bed was gone. I returned to my dorm to find 2 neatly made bunks, Myra's, and a new girl's. She had her own name, her own arc. She asked if I was a groundskeeper. I nearly laughed. I had been erased so efficiently, so precisely, that the world now made room for someone else to take the place I was never meant to hold. The script hadn't glitched. It had evolved. So I sat in the old West Wing, beneath the tapestry where Mara had once hidden her note. I traced the woven threads, fingers aching to feel something true, and I whispered to the dark. They didn't kill her, they made her forget. The pen hummed faintly in response. And I understood then what I had to do. If I couldn't rewrite the past, I could write the truth. Not for the system, not for the arc, not even for the audience. For her. For Mara. Even if it was the last thing I ever wrote. I began crafting a confession. Not a dramatic declaration of love, not some tragic poetry about what was lost. Something simple, something hers. A scene, a memory, written from scratch, made real by remembering it well enough. In the courtyard, she would be chained, accused of deviance, again, of breaking continuity. They would try to make her confess to a crime she hadn't committed, and I would step into the scene. I wouldn't ask for her memory back. I would give her mine. I would write it into the air, into the panel, into the narrative itself. Not to save myself, but to offer her something true, something outside the script. I whispered as I began scripting the scene. But I remember, and I would rather die remembered than live erased. The ink flared red, and the sky outside cracked like the world itself was listening. They staged it perfectly. The execution was scripted like a pageant. Torches flickering with choreographed precision, runes pulsing blue with truth, and an audience of students pretending they didn't crave the spectacle. At the center stood Mara, unbound but surrounded, her wrists adorned with chains laced in glowing confession glyphs, her mouth clamped shut by narrative silence. The charge was familiar: subversion, inconsistency, the suggestion that she had acted beyond her arc. They called her a narrative hazard. I almost laughed. The real hazard was that she had remembered. Or maybe she hadn't. Not yet. Because as she stood beneath the altar's arch, surrounded by symbolism polished to divine aesthetic, she didn't look afraid. She looked bored. Like the scene had played itself out too many times already, like the weight of her own script was heavier than the chains. I walked into the scene before they called my name. Gasps erupted, not from recognition, because no one remembered who I was, but because I stepped off the sidelines. Uninvited, unscripted, and the world is trained to flinch when someone moves outside the ink. The guards hesitated. The runes flickered. Time didn't freeze, but it stuttered. I stood before her, the red pen clenched in my hand, ink already humming like a song only I could hear. I saw the moment her eyes met mine. Nothing sparked, no sudden reunion, just confusion, then wary contempt. They had written me into her as a traitor. Her memory wasn't just gone, it had been replaced. But I didn't flinch. "You remember nothing," I said, my voice cracking beneath the stillness. "But I remember everything." The torches swayed, the wind picked up, though there was no sky, only ceiling, and then suddenly, not ceiling. The illusion faltered for a breath. Students began whispering. Professors glanced at each other. A ripple of unscripted tension ran across the crowd. I stepped closer. The red pen vibrated with pressure. It wanted to be used. "Mara," I said again, more softly now. "You weren't born in a fire. They set you on fire because you didn't fit the light they wanted." Her eyes narrowed. The chains at her wrists glowed brighter, reacting to my voice. But her fingers twitched. "I saw you," I continued, "in the archive reaching for the same book. You didn't flinch, you never looked away, and My throat caught. The next line wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even brave. And I didn't want to be seen by anyone else after that. Her lips parted just slightly. Something flickered in her gaze. I turned to the crowd. "You call her a hazard, a threat. You say she broke structure. But what if structure was the cage?" Lucian stood at the edge of the platform now, his hands behind his back. Unreadable. Waiting to see if I would ruin everything, or rewrite it. I looked back at Mara. "Love is not a subplot," I said, "and neither am I." And then I wrote. I didn't write in a book, I didn't need parchment, I wrote in the air. A single line, carved in red ink that shimmered like memory and bled like prophecy. Her memory was never lost, it was locked. The runes cracked. The chains at Mara's wrists hissed, then melted, not like metal, but like illusions fading. The glyphs sparked and blinked out, the torches burst simultaneously, and the sky opened. Cracked across the dome like stained glass under pressure, reality trembled, pages ripped themselves midair, and Mara, she looked at me, truly looked, and I saw it, the flicker, the fury, the fear, the knowing. "Casil," she whispered, barely audible. But it was enough. The crowd screamed, the professors moved, the guards lunged. But the scene was no longer theirs. Mara stepped beside me, grabbed my hand, and we ran. Through glitching corridors and stairwells that looped back on themselves, past halls that rewrote their architecture as we passed. We ran through narrative fractures and plot holes, through forgotten chapters and unfinished character arcs. The pen still burned in my hand. Her fingers gripped mine like she remembered all of it now. The archive, the note behind the tapestry, the truth of who we were before they tried to polish us into tragedy. We didn't speak. There were no declarations, no melodrama. Just breath and blood and ink. By the time we stopped, we were somewhere between panels, a space where stories paused before deciding if a character deserved to continue, a place the narrative never meant for us to find. We collapsed there, gasping, shaking, alive. She looked at me, truly looked, and said, "They told me you betrayed me." "I did," I whispered. "I betrayed the version of you they wrote." And then, softly, but I never stopped remembering you, somewhere beyond the frame, where canon stutters and episodes thin to silence, there is a space the narrative doesn't track. It's not a location, not really. It's a breath between plot points. A sigh where stories forget to look. We live there now, Mara and I, between the margins of fate. It's not grand. There are no stained glass ceilings or glowing prophecy runes, just parchment dust and fragments of broken glyphs, old timelines that never made it to publication, and doorways to scenes that were cut before anyone could cry for them. It's quiet here, but not empty. We're not hiding, we're choosing. Mara sleeps without chains now. Her fire no longer burns her. She keeps watch while I write, shoulders against the wall, eyes still sharp but no longer armored. Sometimes I catch her smiling at nothing, like a memory she's not ready to speak aloud yet. And I don't ask. We've earned our silences. Our new story doesn't need exposition. It unfolds in gestures, in breath, in how we no longer flinch when the air tightens. The red pen rests near my fingertips as I write. It doesn't float anymore, not unless called. It pulses only when I push too hard, when my emotions spike with old fury and I'm tempted to rewrite someone's death into a resurrection, or vengeance into a flame too bright. I've learned restraint. I learned to write not for spectacle, but for truth. We don't rewrite stories here, we reclaim them. There was a girl we found in Act 1 of a forgotten war saga. Erin, I think her name had once been. She was meant to die shielding her commander. Her body was never recovered. Her name only appeared once more on a statue he wept before in Chapter 12. I wrote her a fragment of continuation, just 3 sentences, enough for her to wake up in the wreckage, alone but breathing, hands burned but still hers. She limped into our space one night, trailing in silence, asking only, "Can I stay?" We didn't answer, we just made room. Then came a boy who had been cursed mute in a children's arc to teach the protagonist empathy. He never got his voice back. The audience loved how sad it was. I gave him 2 lines and a door. He hasn't stopped humming since. And there are others, the ones who were erased mid-dream, the ones who died to prove a theme, the ones who were too quiet, too angry, too complicated to be profitable. They come to us confused, broken, half-named. I don't fix them. I give them space. And in time, they write their own lines. I've stopped wondering what LSR says about me now. Whether they pretend I was never real or call me the infection that broke the frame, I don't care. Lucien's tower no longer stands. Myra walks free now. Her vision's gone quiet. She sent a flower once, folded into a page with no address. A soft white bloom that whispered, "Thank you." I keep it in a tin beside my ink. Sometimes I think back to the archive, the moment Mara and I first reached for the same spine. How silent it was. How holy. Before fire, before betrayal, before we had to scream to be seen. That moment still anchors me. Because it wasn't grand. It wasn't scripted. It was real. That's the kind of writing I do now. I don't use arcs, I use memory. I don't aim for endings, I offer continuations, not always happy, but honestly, Mara calls it dangerous, I call it necessary. The narrative always needed girls like us. It just didn't know what to do when we wrote ourselves back in. Sometimes I catch her reading my scraps before I bind them. Her thumb brushes a name or a phrase and she just stares, long and slow, like tasting truth on paper. She never asks me to stop. She knows. We were both written to be warnings. Now we write invitations. One night, she asked me, voice low against candlelight, "Do you still want to be part of their story?" I looked at the red pen. "No," I said, "I want to give them one." Because I was a plot device, then a rebel, then a ghost. But now I'm the author of every story that forgot to name its girls. They gave me no ending, so I chose to begin, again, in the margins. Sometimes, the world doesn't erase you by force, it erases you by writing over you, recasting your pain as poetic, your silence as noble, your dreams as background color. But you were never meant to be a plot device. You were always a writer in disguise. The lesson here is simple but powerful. If they won't give you a story, write the one they fear. So tell us now, whose story do you still carry that was never told right? Leave it in the comments, and if this story made you feel seen, like, subscribe, and help us write the next one together.